In one shocking moment, millions around the globe disappear. Those left behind face an uncertain future, especially 4 kids who now find themselves alone. As the kids search for help and for answers, they are told the truth behind the disappearances. But are they ready to believe it? Hey everyone, welcome to Ex-Fundie Diaries. My name is Ellie, my pronouns are she, they, and this video is another installment of the ongoing series Ex-Fundie Library, where I talk about the harmful Christian books that I read growing up. It is Halloween week, and in honor of Halloween, I thought I would talk about the horror story that I devotedly read as a teen and tween, Left Behind the Kids, by Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. This book is about the Rapture, which is the evangelical Christian belief that at an unknown time, at literally any moment, the trumpet could sound, calling all of the believers up into the clouds with the Lord. And the unbelievers, the ones who haven't said the sinner's prayer, who haven't made that important decision to live their lives for the Lord, are left behind. Thus the name, Left Behind. Very subtle, I know. Last year for Halloween, I made a video about how, as a Christian fundamentalist evangelical kid, I was not allowed to celebrate Halloween or to go trick-or-treating. Halloween was seen as demonic and evil and of the devil. But some years we did some Christian alternatives to the holiday, including a few All Saints' Day parades. And when I was 11, I dressed as an autumn tree because we were allowed to dress as Bible characters or parts of creation. So as an adult, I have now made it a tradition that every Halloween I wear a crown of orange leaves and I call myself an autumn tree. In that Halloween video, which I will link down below for anyone who would like to watch the whole thing, I talked about how even though we weren't allowed to celebrate Halloween, we were allowed and encouraged to engage in spiritual warfare against demons and evil spirits and Satan, the devil himself. And as a kid and a teenager, I read Christian books that had spiritual warfare themes. And one of these series with a spiritual warfare theme that impacted me the most was the Left Behind the Kids series. And I know I'm not alone in that. An entire generation of evangelical, fundamentalist, Christian kids and teens grew up on these books. I think when I started reading the books, I was around the age of 12, and I was both fascinated and terrified by the events described in them. And this may sound very weird to anyone watching who did not grow up in evangelicalism or Christian fundamentalism, but I believed that these books were basically telling the future. I believed that the Bible was the inspired word of God, that it was inerrant and infallible, and the Left Behind books were just a teeny tiny bit lower than the Bible in terms of their accuracy in my mind. I was just raised to trust the Christian authors that my parents approved of. I was a Christian. I had said the sinner's prayer thousands of times by that point, but I wasn't convinced that I wasn't going to be left behind. And one of my greatest fears, and I know that so many people who were raised like me could relate to this, was that my entire family would be raptured and that I would be left behind. Because a prominent thread throughout this book is that there are some people who thought they were Christians who were left behind. So as I was reading these books, I was thinking, this could be me. I really hope it's not going to be me, but it could be. So I better read up and I better get prepared. And I better make sure that if this happens to me the second time around, I am going to secure my decision for Christ in a way that will not be taken away from me. And as a kid, I found it oddly encouraging that the people who were left behind got a second chance to recommit themselves to the Lord. So I reread this book, book 1, over the course of 2 nights for the first time in almost 2 decades. And I had forgotten or maybe blocked out a lot of it. And I have to say, the first book is actually pretty boring. The action, the actual Rapture, doesn't start until halfway through. So I decided to actually not read the entire book in this video, but rather start in the middle. The first 4 chapters are just introducing the readers to the 4 different kids that are the main characters in the story. And I can basically give you a couple of sentences for each kid so that you know who they are. But before giving you the profiles of these 4 main characters, I think it's important to address the racism of this book. I was not really expecting that when I started reading the book. I'm not surprised because white evangelicalism is full of racism, and if you haven't read the book White Evangelical Racism by Dr. Anthea Butler, I highly recommend it. I will put a link to that down below. But I just didn't remember that race was such a central theme in this book. Out of the 4 main characters, 3 of them are white and 1 is black. Judd, Vicki, and Ryan are all white, and Lionel is black. And Lionel is the only one that we are told what his race is. The other 3 characters are described by their hair color and their eye color, which is very racist and very problematic. They also seem to try to weave some racial commentary throughout the book that is basically pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And the fact that these 2 old white evangelical Christian nationalist men were writing a main character who is supposed to be a black teenager is extremely racist and problematic all on its own. And someone may be asking, well, how do you know they're white Christian nationalists? Well, I will allow Tim LaHaye to speak for himself on this.
Hi, I'm Pastor Tim LaHaye. I've been in the ministry of the gospel for 66 years of my life. I'm sending this message to you today because, frankly, I'm deeply concerned about America. Not just because the liberal secularists control the media, which they do, and public education and many of the governmental policies of our country. I'm concerned because Christians at this crucial time do not get out and vote. In fact, I believe the reason we're in some of the problems we're in is because Christians have not participated in past elections. And so I'd like to challenge you to recognize that we are the largest minority in the whole country. Gallup says that we represent 35 to 40% of the voting population. And if so, then we could change the future of America by just getting 10% more evangelicals out to vote. And that's what I'd like to do with this message, is challenge you to recognize that the opposition is not our friend. In fact, I don't think they're friends of America. What they want is to change America, much like Europe, and become a socialist state where they take from the haves and give to the have-nots and destroy the culture. Socialism has never worked anywhere in the world, and it will not work in America. In addition to my love for the Bible and love for Jesus Christ and souls and men, I have a passion for America. I've always, I was 17 years old and I volunteered for the Air Force in World War II because I just loved America. But I look back on it and I see that in the church that has always taught, that, at least in my background, that they believed in the fundamentals and they believed in obeying the scripture, and that you had to take the Bible literally. And when you apply prophecy to literal interpretation, it makes sense. If you don't use it literally, it doesn't make any other sense. And to me, the signs of the times are evident that we're in the last days. See, in America, for the first 200 years, every school that was founded by a Christian or a church or denomination or some Christian institution. And so it was Bible-based. The Bible was the fundamental, and that's the secret to the Constitution. It's the secret to the way the country was operated. And the overwhelming number of people in our history were Christians, and they wanted to start in fact, of the 13 colonies that sent representatives to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, 7 of them required that the people that they elected in their office had to be believers in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. If you tried something like that today, they'd want to court-martial you or send you to prison. And it's because the secularists have moved in and taken over the Christian schools. There are 4 things I'd like to ask you to do. First, pray for America as never before, that we might experience a moral and spiritual revival in our country, and then God will heal our land. Second, urge your pastor and other people of influence to register as many people as they can between now and Election Day so that we can get out the maximum number of participants. And third, I'd like to urge you to not only vote on Election Day, but help others who can't get to the polls to vote, and increase that number as much as you can. My 4th request is that you circulate this message to as many people as possible electronically. That's one of the joys that we have as private citizens. We can alert other people, and you can do that with your friends and neighbors and people at your church. And if your pastor is not participating, lovingly, thoughtfully urge him to do so and offer to help him. But I really believe that we can turn this country around. And the reason I say that is we did. Back in 1980, when Jerry Falwell called me and invited me to be one of 7 signers of the moral majority and help him move across the country, we had the worst president in the history of America. And it was thousands of ministers that participated in their churches to help us do this. And we can do that again. You can change the future of America by participating yourself and getting others to participate. We're citizens and we're entitled to vote. And every Christian should get out and vote and become concerned. And what should be the basis? Not Democrat or Republican. It's whether the person stands for the principles of the Bible.
Yeah, so that's who wrote this book. Those are the ideologies woven into this book. And of course, that is just one example of the many, many, many harms that these books have done. These books are fear-mongering, they are Christian supremacist, and the writing sucks too. So let's get into it, shall we? The first character we're introduced to is Judd. He is 16, and the book gives him the title The Runaway because he is a disrespectful young man who feels like his parents don't give him enough freedom, and so he uses his dad's name, because he is Judd Jr., to get a credit card, and he decides to take off and fly to London to live there and hide from his parents and live his own life. And the reason he's able to do this is because his family is rich. They're also Christians, but Judd has no time for anything like that. He's embarrassed by all things Christianity. He scoffs at his little sister, and he's rude to his mom. And that's pretty much all you need to know about Judd. The next person we're introduced to is Vicki. She is 14, and the book gives her the title, The Rebel. Whereas Judd's family is rich, Vicki's family is poor. She lives in a trailer park, and boy, does this book love to talk about that over and over again in a very disrespectful and classist way. Again, keep in mind who's writing this book. But basically, her parents have always loved to party and go to these dances at the trailer park, and this one night a preacher comes and he preaches like a fire and brimstone type sermon. So her parents get saved, and so do her siblings. But she thinks it's ridiculous, and she challenges her dad, and whereas he used to be abusive to her, now he cries when she challenges him. So many problems with this book, so many problems. But what I like most about Vicki, despite the fact that she's quite spunky, which of course is seen as a bad thing from these authors' perspective, is that she's bisexual. And no one can argue with me about this because it literally says so right in the first paragraph about her. And I will read it to you to prove this. Vicki Byrne was 14 and looked 18. Tall and slender, she had fiery red hair and had recently learned to dress in a way that drew attention from girls and guys. And later in the chapter, the authors refer to her girlfriend. Now, realistically, they were probably talking about a girl that was her friend. But I'm choosing to believe that that was actually her girlfriend. The next character we're introduced to is Lionel. He is 13, and the book gives him the title, The Liar. And the reason why is not even because he lies. It's because he isn't truly a Christian inside, but his mom thinks that he is. His mom has these dreams of him growing up to become a pastor or a missionary, but privately he doesn't quite believe. And he knows that, and he feels guilty about it. And he just keeps it a secret, except to his Uncle Andre, who is in Alcoholics Anonymous, and who the authors portray as someone who is just taking advantage of the church's like generosity to him because he has no intention of actually becoming a Christian. So he's really written as like a villain, as a what not to do. And honestly, I don't feel comfortable getting into the rest of Lionel's backstory because it's just written so offensively. But again, he's not really even a liar. He just allows his mom to believe that he is a strong Christian when actually he has his private doubts. The last character is Ryan. He is 12, and the book gives him the title, The Skeptic. And I'll be honest, he's kind of the least interesting character. There's not much about him other than he likes video games and he has a best friend named Raimi. And whereas Judd's family is rich and Vicki's family is poor, Ryan's is like middle class, I guess. Again, I don't know what these authors were trying to do. I think they were just really trying to be like, see, look, these four characters are really different, but they still had the same problem. They didn't believe in Jesus. Bad, bad. The one thing that is unique about Ryan, though, is that his parents are not Christians. So at first I was excited because I was like, thank God, at least one of these kids doesn't have to lose their entire family all at once. But I was wrong. Because within the first day after the rapture happens, his dad dies in a plane crash and his mom dies in a car crash. So That was annoying. And I can see the authors just trying to really make sure that all of these kids are completely isolated, because that's what cults do. They have to isolate you so that they can indoctrinate you. So I'm going to start on page 75, halfway through the book, with the third section called The Morning After. So this is right after the rapture has officially occurred, and each of the kids are going to start discovering that this has happened. Chapter 6, Judd returns home. He's on an airplane right now, by the way. Judd was so keyed up, so excited, and yet so worried about what his parents were going to do when they discovered he had disappeared. He couldn't imagine having fallen asleep, yet he had. He figured out how to make the seat back recline, and he was soon staring at the dark ceiling, his eyes beginning to grow accustomed to the low light. He folded his arms across his chest and forced himself to breathe more and more slowly. He had to relax. Needed to get some rest if he was going to succeed in finding a place to hide out in London. Hattie, the flight attendant, glided by every half hour or so, and Judd realized he was finally starting to unwind when he quit looking forward to watching her. Eventually, the slow blinking began. Then he turned sideways and curled up. Now he had to close his eyes or he would appear to stare at the large man in the window seat next to him. The man had said not one word the entire flight, but Judd noticed he had bowed his head before eating. Now what do you think? Do you think he's going to be left behind, or do you think he'll be raptured? Let's find out. That Judd would never do, not even in private, unless he was with his family. That was another reason he needed to be out on his own, so he wouldn't be embarrassed by all their religious rituals. His mother hated when Judd referred to her faith as a religion. She had told him so many times he had it memorized. Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship with God through Christ. Yeah, okay, Judd thought. Same. I have the same reaction to that every time a Christian says it. Yeah, okay. Judd had no idea how long he had been sleeping. In fact, he wasn't sure he had slept at all. And if he had slept, was he really awake now? He was disoriented, in the same position he had curled into how long ago? He felt as if he had been sleeping and had not moved, but his eyes were open. Something was different. A blanket. The flight attendant must have draped it over him. He looked at his watch. Not quite 11 at night, 4 in the morning out over the Atlantic. He knew the plane had to be nearly halfway between England and the States now. The man next to him had a blanket too, but it was folded neatly in his lap. The airflow above him was directed on his face, and Judd imagined him sweating in his sleep. He was spread out over that seat, hands at his sides, head back, mouth open. Judd was grateful the man was not snoring. With his chin on his shoulder, Judd was just inches away from the big man. But that was the way with airplanes. Strangers had to sit close to each other. He looked across the aisle to where the drinker seemed to have collapsed onto his tray table. The drinker. Do you think he will be raptured, or do you think he'll be left behind? Let's find out. Beyond him, the magazine writer, the one who had introduced himself to the old man, sat sleeping with his back straight, his head down, chin on his chest. Ahead of those two was the elderly couple, the Petersons. Judd couldn't see the woman. She was small and hidden in her seat. Her husband had tucked a pillow behind him and slept with his head poking out into the aisle. Judd was still barely awake when Hattie came by. She had to avoid the old man as she slipped past. Judd mustered his courage and whispered, "Thanks for the blanket." She flashed him a smile. "Oh, you're welcome, hon," she said. "My partner Tony brought you that. Need anything else?" He was too tongue-tied to say any more. He shook his head, turned back to face the big man on his right, and drifted off to sleep again. Activity behind him nagged Judd to semi-consciousness. How long had he slept this time? It seemed only a few minutes, but it could have been hours. He didn't want to rouse, didn't want to open his eyes. He fought to stay asleep. Someone had said something. Another person was up and about. Someone walked by quickly. Surely it wasn't dawn yet. Sunlight peeking through the window covering surely would have awakened him. For a minute, Judd heard nothing and was grateful. He brought his watch up to his face and peeked ever so slightly at it. He couldn't make it out. It seemed nearly the same time as the last time he checked. He took a deep breath, then opened his eyes. The man next to him must have gone to the bathroom. Why hadn't Judd felt him get by? Judd's long legs were stretched under the seat in front of him. No way was that man agile enough to have climbed over him without his knowing. He squinted and stared in the darkness, wondering if he was dreaming. The flight attendant hurried past. No, she more than hurried. She was nearly sprinting up the aisle toward the cockpit. This was no dream. Judd sat straight up and noticed a few others doing the same. He craned his neck and looked back toward the circular stairway that led to coach class. He heard too much activity for the middle of the night. Someone shrieked, and another called out, but he couldn't make it out. Just as Hattie reached the cockpit, Judd saw the door open and one of the pilots mosey out. Hattie nearly bowled him over. Judd couldn't hear them, but it was clear she was upset, maybe scared. Did she know something the pilot didn't? Was something wrong with the plane? Wouldn't that be the kick in the teeth, Judd dying in a plane crash on his first night of freedom? His parents would never understand. Hattie pulled the pilot out of the aisle and into the cooking compartments. Judd was desperate to know what was going on. He heard a noise up there, as if she had fallen. He leaned into the aisle and saw her on her knees, whimpering. The captain seemed to be trying to comfort her, and she held on to him as if scared to death. Judd suddenly felt very young and very afraid. Behind him, more people were crying out. What was going on? What were they saying? The young man and the drunk across the aisle were both sound asleep. See, no rapture for the drunk guy. Judd could no longer see the old man, and the two people in front of Judd must have slid down in their seats too. The pilot left Hattie in the galley area and stepped out into the aisle, as if studying the seats in first class. Judd pulled off his blanket and tried to catch the captain's eye, to read something on his face, but it was too dark, and the pilot was distracted. From the seat ahead of him and to the left, he heard the voice of the old woman. "What in the world?" she said. "Harold?" Was something wrong with the old man? Judd couldn't resist standing to look. Everyone else in first class seemed to be sleeping. He unfastened his seatbelt and rose to look at the old couple. The woman sat there with her husband's sweater and dress pants in her hands. Judd shook his head, trying to clear his mind. What was she doing with her husband's clothes? And where was he? Obviously, that's what she was wondering too. The pilot hurried past them before Judd could think how to phrase a question. All he wanted to know was what was going on, but the pilot, and certainly the flight attendant, didn't seem to know either. When the pilot reached the stairs, Mrs. Peterson stood and called out to him. "Sir, my husband!" Judd saw the pilot put a finger to his lips and whisper, "I know, we'll find him. I'll be right back." And now here came Hattie. Judd said, "Ma'am?" But she didn't answer. She grabbed the pilot by the shoulders from behind. "Should I turn on the cabin lights?" she asked. "No," the pilot whispered. "The less people know right now, the better." What did that mean? Judd watched the two hurry down the stairs. He turned back to see the old woman talking to the rider behind her. He was dragging his fingers through his long blonde hair. "Trouble, ma'am?" Buck said. "It's my Harold," she said. "Does he need something?" Buck asked, stretching. "He's gone." "I'm sorry?" "He disappeared." "Well," Buck said, "I'm sure he slipped off to the washroom while you were sleeping." "Would you mind checking for me and take a blanket?" "Ma'am?" "I'm afraid he's gone off naked. He's a religious person and he'll be terribly embarrassed." Now my question is, if he's so religious, at least in the evangelical Christian sense, why did he marry a non-Christian? Is that not unequally yoked? Answer me that, old guy who got raptured? Judd still stood as if glued to the floor in front of his seat. He watched Buck Williams climb over the sleeping drunk in the aisle seat and move up to take a blanket from the old woman. Buck crouched and studied the clothes Mr. Peterson had left in his seat. "Does your husband have epilepsy?" "No." "Sleepwalking?" "No." "I'll be right back." Judd didn't want to look down into the seats in front of him, and he certainly didn't want to look to his right where the big man had been, but he forced himself to. Over the backs of the seats ahead of him, he saw blankets, pillows, and full sets of clothes. Glasses, jewelry, even a man's wig lay on his seat. His heart racing, Judd looked next to him. That neatly folded blanket now lay atop flat trousers that led to empty socks and shoes. On the back of the seat lay the limp, still buttoned white shirt, the still knotted tie, and little bits of metal. Judd's knees were weak. Other passengers woke up and discovered their seatmates missing, their clothes left behind. Which I don't really understand. So many questions. First of all, are they naked when they get to heaven? And is that okay now because it's heaven? Also, I thought it was the souls that go to heaven because you're supposed to get a new body in heaven, right? I think that the authors just love the drama of this. The drama of clothes being left behind is just too good for them to pass up. Judd leaned close to the big man's pile of clothes and turned on the overhead light. He could still smell the man's cologne, and those tiny bits of metal were dental fillings. Buck Williams moved past Judd's seat. "Excuse me," he said to another passenger. "I'm looking for someone." "Who isn't?" a woman said. The pilot rushed back toward the cockpit, followed by his flight attendant. She told Buck, "Sir, I need you to return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt." Hattie turned and gave Judd a look as if she expected the same from him. He sat quickly and refused to look at the clothes his seatmate had left behind. Buck tried to explain. "I'm looking for..." "Everybody is looking for someone," Hattie said. "We hope to have some information for you in a few minutes. Now please." When Hattie passed him, Judd quickly left his seat and ran to the stairway. Halfway down, he saw the cabin lights finally come on. All over the plane, people held up clothes and gasped or shrieked that someone was missing. Judd walked stiff-legged back to his seat and heard Buck tell Mrs. Peterson, "Apparently many people are missing." She looked afraid and puzzled. Judd was afraid too, but he wasn't puzzled. As the pilot came over the intercom, pleading for everyone to remain calm, the full realization of what had happened hit Judd. He didn't know how many other people on the plane had any idea, but he sure did. Christ had come as he promised and raptured his church. Judd lowered his face into his hands and shuddered. It was the worst nightmare imaginable, and he was wide awake. He and most of the passengers on that plane had been left behind. Judd raised his head when Hattie approached again. Her face was red and puffy, and she breathed fast, seeming to fight for control. She stopped in the aisle right next to him and put her hand on his seat back to steady herself. Draped over her arm was a sweater vest with a shirt and tie still in it. The nameplate dangling in front of Judd read Tony. The pilot's voice came over the intercom and announced that cards would be passed out to determine who and how many were missing. Hattie roused the sleeping drunk on the aisle. That's so disrespectful. The sleeping drunk. Hattie roused the sleeping drunk on the aisle and asked if any in his party were missing. He drooled, his eyes heavy. "Missing? No. And there's nobody in this party but me." He closed his eyes again, and Judd knew he had no idea what had happened. That heathen. Later, when the captain announced they were turning around and heading back to Chicago, Judd led the cheering. Home had never sounded so good. His plan, his crazy, stupid, selfish plan, was out the window now. He would pay his dad back for the money he had already taken with the card, and if it wasn't too late, he would get right with God. It seemed strange to even think that way, and he suddenly realized that if he was right about what had happened, he would be going home to an empty house. Judd dropped his head again and felt the tears come. From across the aisle, he heard Buck say to the sleeping drunk, "I'm sorry, friend, but you're going to want to be awake for this." The drunk said, "If we're not crashing, don't bother me." In spite of their terror, passengers seemed to settle down for the long flight back to Chicago. Judd refused all offers of food and beverage, unable to think of anything but what he might find at home. As the heavy plane retraced its route across the Atlantic, it retreated from the rising sun. The pilot announced that they were going all the way back to Chicago because most other airports were jammed and closed. He also said to expect chaos on the ground because these disappearances had happened everywhere around the world at the same time. Judd saw Hattie and Buck talking. She told him that even more bizarre than the vanishings was the fact that every single little child on the plane had disappeared. Many adults and some teenagers, but all the babies. That's because of the belief in the age of accountability, which I believe is 7. I was not taught, actually, about the age of accountability. That's something that I learned later when I was like maybe a teenager or an adult. But when I was a small child, the fear of hell was extremely present for as long as I can remember. And I said the sinner's prayer at age 3, and my mom had been praying that I would say it, well, pretty much ever since I was born. So I don't think my parents believed in the age of accountability. I think maybe they would say that like a baby or like a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old maybe might be too young and they would get raptured. But they definitely believed that 3-year-olds could go to hell for not saying the sinner's prayer. Because I said it at age 3. That awakened the sleeping man on the aisle. "What in the blazes are you two talking about?" he said. "We're about to land in Chicago," Hattie said. "I've got to run." "Chicago?" the man demanded. "You don't want to know," Buck said. Judd looked out the window as the plane cut through the clouds and offered a view of the Chicago area. Smoke, fire, cars off the road and smashed into each other, and trees and guardrails. Planes in pieces on the ground, emergency vehicles, lights flashing, picking their way across the debris. I remember adults making a really big deal out of these details of what it would be like once the rapture happened. They just really wanted to terrify us enough that we would take this shit seriously. As the airport came into view, it was obvious no one was going anywhere soon. There were planes as far as the eye could see. Some crashed, some burning, the others gridlocked in line. People trudged through the grass toward the terminals. Cranes and wreckers tried to clear a path through the front of the terminal so traffic could move, but that would take hours, if not days. The pilot announced that he would have to land the plane 2 miles from the terminal, and that passengers would have to slide down the inflatable emergency chutes to get to the ground. All Judd cared about was getting on the ground. He would run all the way to the terminal, where he could call home. He would ask someone how he could get home, and he was willing to pay any amount. He had that credit card and the wads of cash in his pocket. Half an hour later, when Judd came huffing and puffing past the crowds and into bigger crowds in the terminal, he saw lines 100 long waiting for the phones. On TVs throughout the terminal, he watched news stories from around the world of people disappearing right out of their clothes in front of the camera. A nurse vanished as a woman was about to give birth, and the baby disappeared before it was born. A groom disappeared as he was putting his bride's ring on her finger. Again with the unequally yoked marriages. What is this book teaching? Blasphemy, I tell you. Pallbearers at a funeral disappeared while carrying a casket, which fell and popped open, revealing that the corpse had vanished too. Judd raced outside and through the jammed cars, following lines of people to cabs and limousines. He sprinted to the front and stuffed a huge roll of bills into the driver's hand. Judd told him his address and the man pulled away. It took 2 hours to pick their way through the results of crashes and fires. The limo driver said, "Some people disappeared with stuff cooking on the stove, and there was no one there to turn it off. That's why you see so many homes burned or burning." When they finally reached Judd's street in Mount Prospect, the driver stopped and said, "There you go, son. Sure hope you find what you're expecting." "I hope I don't," Judd said. I have run out of time to film for today. I need to go get ready for work. So please stay tuned for part 2 of this video, where we will read the exciting conclusion of Left Behind the Kids, Book 1, The Vanishings. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.